Pesachim, Dafim Ayin Vav through Pei Beis. Daf Ayin Vav is an island in the middle of all the sugyas of Kudshim, which are of limited practical applicability. Daf Ayin Vav is just chock full, packed with halachos that are core Yoredea halachos, Basar B'chalav, kashrus in general. The halacha l'maisa bottom line application of these halachas is extremely complex, but we'll go through some of the basic outlines of some of the important sugyas on Daf Ayin Vav. Gemara actually began on Ayin Hey. The Gemara brings cham l'tel cham. If you have two items that touch each other and they're both hot, then if one of them is non-kosher, or if one is meat and one is milk, then blios, absorbed taste, transfers from one to the other, and they're awesome. If you have tzonin l'tel tzonin, if they're both cold, then blios do not pass when they're both cold. So they're mutter. You have to rinse them off, the halacha is, but they're mutter. If you have cham l'tel tzonin and tzonin l'tel cham, when one is hot and one is cold, this is a machlokas Rav and Shmuel. Rav Amar Ila Gavar, the temperature of the upper one is dominant. If the upper one is hot, we treat them like they're both hot. If the upper one is cold, we treat them like they're both cold. Shmuel Amar Tasa Gavar, Shmuel says the temperature of the lower one is dominant. If the lower one is hot, we treat them like they're both hot. If the lower one is cold, we treat them like they're both cold. Halacha follows Shmuel, we paskin Tasa Gavar. So when two things touch, meat and milk, meat and cheese, treif and kosher meat, we look at the bottom one. If the bottom one is hot, the halacha is like they're both hot, and that's a serious case. When the top one is hot, it's much more lenient. It's really not a problem, except that you need klipa. The Gemara explains that even though the temperature of the bottom one, which is cold, is dominant, and we look at the top one as being cold also, but as that happens, a little bit of blia occurs, and it goes in k'dei klipa, which is a small amount. You have to shave off the outer layer of the one that becomes asur, or both become asur if it's meat and cheese. So that's how we paskin tasa gover. Post can discuss what if they're side by side, and in general there are tremendous complications in this halacha, but this is the basic rule. Later on the daf, the Gemara talks about an episode. There was a bar gozla. There was a bird, a shechted piece of fowl meat, and it fell into a kada de kamcha. It fell into a jar of some type of dairy dish, dairy liquid. So the halacha is mutter. Now the halacha is not so simple that it's mutter. The Gemara brings four other factors. It depends whether it was maluach, whether it was salty. It has to be very salty, but beyond maluach, the Gemara, usually it's not going to be that maluach. Most foods we have, the Gemara says it has to be nimlach, she'eno nechel machmas malchos, so salted as a preservation that it's not even edible because it's so salty. That's not so common. But the other three criteria, the Gemara says, it depends whether it is chai or tli, raw or roasted. Then if it's roasted, it needs klipa. It needs, again, to be shaved off. It depends whether it has pili, whether the bird has crevices in it. If the crevices, it absorbs more. Then it's asur. The whole thing is asur. If it has tavlin, if the bird is spiced, then also the whole thing is asur. So the basic halacha is somewhat perhaps counterintuitive in its basic heter. The heter is counterintuitive. Most of us would probably assume that if you take a piece of chicken, you pour milk all over it, most of us would probably think it's going to be asur. But the halacha is no. The Gemara says, at least in certain cases, you can simply wash off the chicken, wash off the meat, and you can simply get rid of all the milk, and you can eat it. However, before you actually do that, there are three other criteria which have to be considered, whether it's raw or roasted or cooked or baked. One, whether it has crevices, and whether it is spiced. Now, there's a major machlokes rishonim how these three criteria are applied. There are three views. The most lenient view is that when it's raw, that if it's not cooked, nothing is a problem. It could have cracks, it doesn't matter. When it's not cooked, everything is fine. Whether it has cracks or not, just wash it off, everything is fine. The problem only starts when it's cooked, and according to the most lenient opinion, the problem only starts when it's roasted or cooked, and it's still hot. If it's roasted, cooked, and it's still hot, then you need k'dei klipa, and if besides being hot and cooked, it also has crevices or spice, then it's asur entirely. But as long as it's not hot, even if it's cooked, you have a cooked piece of chicken, you put it in your refrigerator, a bottle of milk spills all over it, as long as it was already cold, it cooled off in the fridge, everything is fine, even if it has cracks. That's the most lenient view. The intermediate view is that raw chicken is fine, even if it has cracks, but once it was cooked, even if it cooled down, that already is a problem if it has cracks. That we have to be machmer, even if it's cool. When the Gemara says tzli, it means cooked, even if it already cooled down. And the third opinion is the Sefer HaTruma. The Sefer HaTruma says that's the most stringent opinion, that when it's roasted, even if it's cold, even if it cooled down, then it needs klipa. But if it has cracks, even if it is raw, then it's entirely asur. So the three shittas are that that one shita says if it's cold, it's always mutter, even if it's already been cooked. And if it's hot, then it needs klipa, and if it has cracks, it's all entirely asur. But if it's cold, even cooked, everything is fine. The intermediate shita is that if it's roasted or cooked, then even if it's cold, it needs either klipa, or if it has cracks, then it's going to be all asur. But if it's raw, it's okay. How do we paskin? The most stringent view of the Sefer HaTruma is not brought at all in the Shulchan Aruch. The Shulchan Aruch himself brings the lenient view that the problem is only when it's hot. Then you need either klipa or the whole thing is asur if it has cracks. The Ramah brings the intermediate view that some say as long as it's been cooked, even if it's cold, there are going to be problems of klipa or of asuring it totally if it has cracks. The Ramah says you should be machmer like the intermediate shita unless there's hefsin meruba. But the Ramah seems to paskin that if it's raw, again, raw piece of chicken, you put it in the fridge to defrost, a bottle of milk spilled all over it, even if it has cracks, everything is fine. Ramah seems to paskin that way. There are some achronim who say you should be machmer in a case where there's no hefsid meruba, where it's not that difficult. You should be machmer that even if it's raw, if it has crevices, it's asur. Where Rabbi Forth paskins in his book, he says cold raw meat falls into cold milk. Milk is permitted. Meat, you wash it off, it's also permitted. If it has crevices, you should ask a Mara Hara, because there is the sheet to the Sefer HaTruma that if it has crevices, even when it's raw, you should be more machmer, so ask a Mara Hara. It's not strictly asur, but it might be recommended to be machmer, so ask a Mara Hara. If it's cooked, then the Ramah paskins that without hefsin meruba, you need klipa, so you have to take off a klipa. If it has crevices and it's cooked, then we asur the meat. If there's serious financial loss, we follow the Ramah, ask a shaila, ask a Mara Hara, Rabbi Forrest says, to see whether the individual circumstances warrant the leniency of hefsin meruba. Yet another important halacha on this daf of kashrus, the Gemara talks about bread that was baked in an oven together with meat. So they didn't touch. We're not talking about gravy that trickled along the surface of the oven. We're not talking about, they didn't actually touch. So the bread and the meat were simply baked in the same oven at the same time. So the halacha is the bread is considered fleishiks, and you're not allowed to eat the bread. You're not allowed to eat the bread with milk. This is called recha. This is a principle called recha, not to be confused with zeya. But recha means that in certain cases, in enclosed spaces, if you have two foods, even if they don't touch, they exchange some tam just through the confined space. That's called recha. L'chatchila, we try to avoid recha in general. But diavad, there are all kinds of complications when we're makro b'diavad and when we're not makro b'diavad. Our case, even though it sounds like b'diavad, you already cooked the meat together with the bread. The poskim explain that that's considered like b'diavad generally, because you always have the option of eating the bread by itself, or eating the bread with parv, or eating it with meat. If you cooked it with meat, you can eat it with meat. So if you don't need to eat it with milk, so that's like l'chatchila. L'chatchila b'choshesh for recha, the Gemara is telling us, and we should treat the bread as fleshik. In general, Rabbi Forrest explains again, the rules of recha are don't l'chatchila at least, but the is more complicated, but l'chatchila, don't roast kosher meat and non-kosher meat in your oven at the same time. Probably not something most of us were planning on doing. We should be machmer for fat meat, for lean meat, for all kinds of meat. Don't roast treif and kosher in the oven at the same time. Don't roast meat and dairy in the oven at the same time. Again, probably not something most of us were contemplating doing, but don't do that l'chatchila either. You're allowed to bake kosher and non-kosher bread in the same oven, if you happen to have non-kosher bread, because bread me'ikar adin does not emit recha, but poskim recommend, ideally you shouldn't do that either. And as we said, if you did do it, so b'diavad, there are certain leniencies, but bread that was cooked, bread that was baked in an oven together with meat, l'chatchila, it's like l'chatchila, because you can always eat the bread by itself. The Rav Yonasan Abshit says that in a case where if there's no other bread available to eat with the dairy, then the post can say that you could. That's like b'diavad. You can eat it with dairy, provided that you can't eat the bread by itself. You can't eat the dairy by itself. Rav Yonasan Abshit says That's b'diavad because you have no other choice. Then you could even eat the bread together with the milk. But l'chatchila, you should treat the bread as fleishiks and not eat it with dairy. And this is all when there were actually two foods in the oven at the same time, one kosher, one non-kosher, one meat and one dairy. If we're talking about cooking something, let's say parv in a meat oven, or even or even roasting something dairy in a meat oven, that's a whole separate question. Where the arsig is where you actually have two foods in the oven. That's a sugya of recha. The halacha of cooking parv or dairy in a meat oven, that's a considerably more complicated question and more basis for leniency. Not totally mutter, consult a rabbi, but that's a more complicated question. On Daf Ayin Zayin, the Gemara is talking about the rules of, again, back to karbanos, different karbanos that are going to be docha Shabbos or not. So the Gemara says that karbanos tzibur generally are docha Shabbos. We might have thought that the karbanos of Rosh Chodesh are different because they're not considered moed. So the drasha of being docha comes from the word moed, but Rosh Chodesh is not called a moed. Kamash Malan, the Gemara says, no, Rosh Chodesh is called a moed. Why? The Gemara brings a curious drasha. The Gemara says that it says karalai moed l'shbar bachurai. In Eicha it says that Hashem called it a moed that was going on Tammuz. So we see that Rosh Chodesh is called a moed. Tosha says, really, in the standard Parshas HaMoados and Parshas Pinchas, Rosh Chodesh is not called a moed. Tosha says in Parshas Pinchas it does say Rosh Chodesh. And it says, Eila ta'aseh b'moadechem. These are the musafim that you bring on the Moadim. So we would have thought, Tosha says, that that's not going back on Rosh Chodesh to the other Yom Tovim. So our Gemara is debating the question of whether Rosh Chodesh is called a Moed. So the Gemara is discussing it in the context of the laws of Karbanos. But there is one interesting practical application to this, whether you're allowed to do malacha on Rosh Chodesh. So there are sources in Chazal that Rosh Chodesh, Gemara says explicitly, is Eino Asr Basiyas Malacha. You're allowed to do Malacha on Rosh Chodesh. That's what we do. There are various Gemaras that say that. There are other Gemaras that indicate that you don't do Malacha on Rosh Chodesh. So the Rishonim grapple with these contradictions. And in particular, there's Yerushalmi that says women don't do Malacha on, some women at least have the minhag not to do Malacha on Rosh Chodesh. Some women had that minhag. And in Midrash Pirkei Rebbe Eliezer it says, the reason women have, it's a privilege, it's not a burden, it's a privilege. The reason women have the privilege of an extra Yom Tov, the Yom Tov of Rosh Chodesh, is because they were righteous with regard to the sin of the golden calf. They didn't give their rings, their nizamim, their earrings, their nose rings to the Egel. They refused. They said, we're not contributing to Avodah Zarah. Hashem rewarded them by giving them an extra Yom Tov of Rosh Chodesh. So again, it's a lesson. Sometimes we might think of the restrictions of Shabbos and Yom Tov as onerous, as burdens. It's not a punishment. It's a blessing. Women who were tzidkanios, they get an extra Yom Tov of Rosh Chodesh. The Torah brings from his brother, Rav Yechiel, another one of the Rosh's sons, that the Moadim were connected to Avos, Pesach, Shavuos, Sukkot were connected the three Avos, and the Yud Beis Rosh Chodesh were connected to the Yud Beis Shvatim, and when the Jews sinned at the Egel, that Yom Tov was taken away, or it wasn't given to the general Jewish people, it was given to women. Shulchan Aruch brings Rosh Chodesh is mutter basiyas malacha, mikra dinin can do malacha on Rosh Chodesh. Some women have the custom not to do malacha. The Shulchan Aruch endorses the custom as per the Chazals. It's a minhag tov, it's a good minhag. So, and this is based on the idea that Rosh Chodesh is a Yom Tov. It's not a Yom Tov for everyone, but it's a Yom Tov for women. On Daf Ayin Ches, the Gemara says that Rabbi Nassan says, Achilas Pesachim lo ma'akva. A carbon Pesach is still valid, is still kosher if it doesn't get eaten. The Gemara brings a brisa that to support that's what Rabbi Nassan holds. The Gemara proposes, the Gemara rejects this, but the Gemara says we have a brisa that says Minayin. Rabbi Nassan says Minayin shekol Yisrael yotzim Pesach echad. How do we know that all Israel, the entire Jewish people, can fulfill the mitzvah of Karim Pesach with the same animal? Talmud Lomar v'shachatu also kol ka'al adas Yisrael ben harabayim. The entire congregation of Israel can slaughter a Karim Pesach. One Karim Pesach. How is that possible? A Pesach is only shechted one time. How can all of Klal Yisrael be yotze with one carbon? So the halacha is they could. That one person shechts, and he shechts on behalf of the whole Klal Yisrael. They can't all eat. There's not that much meat in the carbon, and each one is going to get less than a kazayas. So that's achila is not ma'akev, but they can all be yotze with one carbon. One person shechts on behalf of all of them. This Gemara highlights a problem in halacha which many achronim grapple with. Pesach has two components. As all these figures discussed, there is the offering of the carbon, the shechting of the carbon, the avodah of the carbon, and then there's the eating of the carbon. So when it comes to shechting the carbon, we have shlichus, we have agency. I don't shecht my carbon personally. I can shchitas ksher bazar, the Gemara explains. I can have another Yisrael do it. One person shechts on behalf of everyone. All Yisrael can be yotze with one Pesach. One person shechts, everyone is yotze. Achilas carbon Pesach, you certainly cannot have someone else eat the Pesach for you. You have to eat the Pesach yourself. You have to eat a kazayis of the Pesach yourself. Why? Why is this? Why does the halachic doctrine of shlichus, of agency, work for the shchita and not for the achila, not for the eating? In general, Achronim struggle to understand why does shlichus, why does agency work for certain mitzvahs and not for other mitzvahs? In certain contexts, we apply shlichus, we let one person do a mitzvah for somebody else. Mila, as understood by many Achronim, is shlichus. The father makes the mohel a son, makes the mohel a shliach to do the circumcision of his son. Other mitzvahs, many mitzvahs, maybe most mitzvahs, you can't. You can't make someone a shliach to sit in the sukkah for you. You can't make someone a shliach to eat the Karban Pesach for you, to eat matzah for you, to put on tefillin for you. Why? When do we say shlichus? When do we not say shlichus? So the Achronim give a variety of different approaches. Some of the later Achronim, the Ar Sameach and the Halachos Yav, they say something very similar. They say, when the Torah gives a mitzvah, the mitzvah is, the Torah wants you to do the mitzvah. It's not just a legal formality. You should find some legal fiction to get around doing the mitzvah. The Torah wants you to do the mitzvah. The Torah says you should eat matzah, lechem oni. Someone else eats matzah, you don't eat matzah. So that you're defeating the whole purpose of the Torah. The Torah says put on tefillin. It's a great mitzvah, tefillin. Someone else puts on tefillin. What do you mean shlichus? You didn't put on tefillin. So the Halachos Yoav and the Ar Sameach explain a mitzvah that has multiple parts. So if you make a shliach to do one stage of the mitzvah, but you're still going to be doing another part of the mitzvah or the fundamental part of the mitzvah, that's fine. So when it comes to Pesach, someone else will shech the Pesach for you. That's a mitzvah to shech it. Someone else will do that part of the mitzvah, but you'll eat it. So it's still your carbon Pesach. You make a shliach to do milah, for example. Well, the milah is still done to the child. It's your child, and you got him circumcised. So it's not just someone else halfway around the world is doing milah and you're getting credit for it in someone's accounting ledger. You're having your own son circumcised. When it comes to a shliach for kedushin and so on, so it's a mitzvah to do kedushin, and it's a legal process by which a woman becomes married to you. She becomes married to you, so you end up with the marriage. So as long as you have something out of it, you can have shlichus. But something which has no connection to you, someone's going to eat matzah, and you have nothing, you have no connection to the mitzvah, that you can't do. And therefore, Karban Pesach, they say, you can have someone do the shechita because you'll still eat the Pesach, so you'll still fulfill the mitzvah in the sense that you'll eat it. But if you would have someone else eat it for you as well, then you have nothing. All you have is you want to get some kind of abstract connection to someone else's mitzvah. That you can't do. That's how more or less, how the similar approaches of the Ar Sameach and the Halachos Yav. On Daf Ayin Tes, the Gemara talks about Tumah. The halacha is that Karban Pesach, Karban Tzibur, Karban Pesach can be brought betumah if all the tzibur, or over the tzibur, or all the kohanim, or over the kohanim, or the klishares, if they're tamei, then tumah hutra b'tzibur, and for Karban Pesach as well, you can bring the Pesach betumah if most of the kohanim, the Yisraelim, and so on are tamei. So the Gemara talks about the question of whether if it's going to be tamei anyway, should you avoid having it more serious? Should you still try to minimize the aspect of tumah? If you have tumas basar, the meat of the carbon is tamei. Should you still try to avoid eating it, but tumas haguf, where the person doing the avodah, the person eating it is tamei? That's a more serious kind of tumah, where the person doing it has tumas haguf, which is more serious. So it's tamei anyway. The animal's tamei. So is there still any reason to avoid tumas haguf? So the Gemara says this would depend on whether we say Tumah Dechuyahi B'tzibur, or the alternative is Tumah Hutra B'tzibur. Dechuyahi B'tzibur is, Rashi says, B'koshi Hutra. We kind of grudgingly or with difficulty we allow it, but we're not excited about it. So therefore, minimize the Tumah. So reduce the Tumah as much as you can. If Tumah is Hutra B'tzibur, it's mutter. It's not asur at all. So don't worry about it. It's entirely mutter. Again, we don't have the Karban Pesach today. Meheri Yibana Beis HaMikdash, and we'll have it again. We're not currently bringing karbanos, but this question of dechuya and hutra, with these types of nafkaminas, of whether you have to limit the infraction as much as you can, or it doesn't matter, comes up in several other areas of halachas as well. There are several other sugyas in Shas that talk about dechuya and hutra. In Shas, the discussion generally is about tumah. In various mesechtas, the discussion is about tumah. the poskim extend the discussion of Dechuya and Hutra to other contexts as well. So first of all, within the context of Tumah, the poskim talk about Tumas Kohanim for Krovim. The halacha is a Kohen is not allowed to be mitame himself to a mace in general, but for the Zayin Krovim, for 7 relatives, close relatives, father, mother, brother, sister, etc., he is allowed to. So the question is that only to take care of the mace, to do what's absolutely necessary, or is that in general? It's Hutra entirely. Once he can become Tameh, he can become Tameh for no reason, and certainly if there's a minor reason, even if it's not a pressing reason. So the halacha is machlokes rishonim, whether the Kohen is allowed to become Tameh Shalol L'Tzarech. The Kohen can become Tameh Shalol L'Tzarech for one of the 7 Krovim. And the Minchas Chinuch explains, the question is whether it's Dechuya or Hutra. If it's Dechuya, Tumah really still applies, but grudgingly we allow you to become Tameh, so limit it to where it's necessary. If it's Hutra, there's no Isser. The Isser is entirely revoked in this context, then you don't need to be careful and only do it when necessary. This is Machlokes Rishonim, and some Achronim at least propose this explanation for the Machlokes Rishonim. There's also a great discussion about Pikuach Nefesh on Shabbos. When you save a life on Shabbos, you drive someone to the hospital, you perform an operation to save somebody's life, these types of Chilul Shabbos, of course it's mutter, but the question is it Dechuya or is it Hutra? Rambam's language is Dechuya hi Shabbos eitzel sekanas nefashos, kishar kol mitzvahs. Rambam says Dechuya. What are the ramifications of this? So there is a machlokus in the Shulchan Aruch, Mechaber and the Ramah, whether if a person has to do malacha for pikuach nefesh, somebody is in mortal danger and he needs your help, should you try to do malacha with the shinui? Should you try to do it in a way that's not Chilul Shabbos Daraisa? Rav Asher Weiss points out, he's one of the ones who discusses this question of Dechuya and Hutra, Pikuach Nefesh. He says the Gemara never talks about it outside the context of Tumah Hutra B'tzibur or Dechuya B'tzibur, but Achronim we can try to apply it to other cases as well. So he brings this machlokas about whether we try to do malacha with a shinui in the case of Pikuach Nefesh, and he says it seems that that's the machlokas whether it's Dechuya or Hutra. If it's Dechuya, we try to avoid the Chilul Shabbos. If we can do it with the Shinui, which is not Chilul Shabbos Daraisa, it's not Mutter, L'chachila, but it's not Chilul Shabbos Daraisa, we recommend that. Of course, not if it's going to increase the possibility of death, but if there's no difference, we try to do it with the Shinui. If you hold Hutra, you don't have to, maybe. Then he has another explanation of the Machlokas, it's not totally on Dechuya and Hutra. Then he brings a couple of other potential ramifications of the question of whether Pikuach Nefesh on Shabbos is Dechuya or Hutra. He brings from the Shulchan Aruch Harav. If a cholish yesh basakana, he's in mortal danger, and he needs some treatment. However, it's close to the end of Shabbos. It's 5 minutes before Shabbos is over. He can wait 5 minutes. Should you try to wait or not? So the Shulchan Aruch Harav says, certainly if there's any chance that he'll die because of that, any chance that his condition will deteriorate, certainly in Mechal Shabbos. But if we're convinced it's right before the end of Shabbos, and we're convinced that there's no harm in waiting, then the Shulchan Aruch Harav says it's better to wait. So that sounds like, and he says because it's Dechuya, because Shabbos is only Dechuya, so if there's really no difference, it's better to wait till after Shabbos. The implication is, Rav Weiss says, that if it would be Hutra, he'd say, no problem, just do it right away, it's mutter, there's no issue, you don't have to worry about it. But he says that he implies this would depend on whether it's Dechuya or Hutra, and the Rambam Paskin's Dechuya. He also brings an interesting shuvah from Rav Moshe. Rav Moshe talks about a doctor who's going to be Mechal Shabbos to save Jewish lives. He knows that he'll have some patients, some work to do on Shabbos that will be mutter on Shabbos to save lives. But should he try to find a replacement? Should he try to find someone else in his practice to cover him on Shabbos? So Ramosha says it depends on whether Shabbos is Dechuya or Hutra. If it's Dechuya, we allow you to save lives. It's a mitzvah to save lives. But if you can avoid it, if you can have a non-Jew cover you on Shabbos, whether he's not mitzvah on Shabbos, then that's even better because it's only Dechuya. If we can find a solution that doesn't involve Chilul Shabbos, that's great, that's ideal. If it's Hutra on Shabbos, no, it's not Asur. There's no Isser of Shabbos there, it's to do it yourself. So no problem at all. Rav Asher Weiss himself says he thinks that even if Shabbos is Hutra entirely, he still thinks it would be a good idea to avoid, for the Jewish doctor to avoid working on Shabbos, even if it's Hutra, because it's an ideal. Ideally, one should know that Shabbos is holy and one should avoid doing malacha on Shabbos. And one should try to medactic as much as possible without Chilul Shabbos. We should note this whole discussion is about a doctor who's working on Shabbos because of Pikuach Nefesh. This is a whole separate discussion from the question of a resident, a doctor going to medical school who's going to have to who's going to have to work on Shabbos because that's what the school wants him to do, but he's not necessarily saving lives. That's a much more serious question. That's something else. We're talking here about a doctor who is going to work on Shabbos because of Pikuach Nefesh. Should he try to get a non-Jew to cover him? That's something already where there is, that's what these Achronim are talking about. On Daf Pei, the Gemara talks about a person who is Tameh on the first day of Yom Tov, first day of Pesach, first day of Sukkot. So will he be able to bring the Chagiga? The Chagiga is brought on Yom Tov. The question is, if he's Tameh on the first day, can he bring the Chagiga after he becomes Tar on a later day of Yom Tov? So the Gemara says it depends. If you that which you can bring the Chagiga for every day of Yom Tov, if you say each day of Yom Tov is an independent Zman of the Chagiga, it's an independently eligible time, then yeah, if you're Tameh the first day, bring it on the second day. But if you say Kulu Tashlumin Derishonin, all the other days are Tashlumin, they're makeups for the first day, then if you were Tameh on the first day and you were ineligible, Kivandlo, that the Chazi Barishon, Chazi Bakulu, if you were eligible on the first day, you can bring it the other days. If you were ineligible because you were Tameh, you don't get the makeups either. The makeups are only for someone who was eligible on the first day. So this is the principle the Gemara establishes. It's an open question which one Chagiga is, but if something is only Tashlumin, then we apply the rule that if you were disqualified on the first day, you don't bring it on any other day as well. Tashlumin is only for someone who was eligible the first day and for some reason didn't bring it on the first day. There is a Machlokes Rishonim in the laws of Avelis. Someone who's an onain, who's had a relative die and the body hasn't been buried yet, so the halacha is that he's patur from mitzvahs. So the question was, if a person had a relative die on Shabbos, he was an onain on Matzei Shabbos, so he didn't do Havdalah. And now it's Sunday afternoon, the Kvura happened on Sunday afternoon, does he do Havdalah? So this was a Machlokes Rishonim. The ones who said you do Havdalah, they say even though Havdalah is ideally done on Matzei Shabbos, Havdalah can be done the first 3 days of the week. So just like if a person was an onain until 10 o'clock in the morning, so you didn't daven Shachris, at 10 o'clock you daven Shachris because the Zman of Shachris is still Chatzos if you have to. So you see you can still daven Shachris because it is, because the first half of the Zman you were ineligible, then you became eligible. Havdalah works the same way. The beginning of the Zman, Matzei Shabbos, Sunday morning, you were ineligible. Afterwards you become eligible, and that's how the Shulchan Aruch paskins. Other Rishonim said no. Other Rishonim said the Iker Zman of Havdalah is Matzei Shabbos, and they compare it to Karbanos. They bring a Gemara and Chagiga, a different case, but a similar principle, that when there's Tashlumin, if you were ineligible the first day, you were ineligible for the Tashlumin as well. The Onain was ineligible for Havdalah, mitzvahs asayis don't apply to him. He was ineligible for Havdalah on Matzei Shabbos, and therefore, even after he becomes eligible in the secondary Zman, the Zman of the Tashlumin, he doesn't do Havdalah. Again, the Shulchan Aruch paskins that you do Havdalah because the Zman of Havdalah goes for 3 days during the week. The Magen Avraham says, if a person becomes an onain and then the mace is buried, so what about davening? So he says, the Magen Avraham says that davening, he says, if the mace is buried, you say Kriya Shema and then you daven if it's still the morning. However, he says, Birchas HaShachar you don't say. Birchas HaShachar, once you missed it in the morning, you're done. Why? Levushei Srad explains, because even though when it comes to Havdalah, we paskin that the Zman of Havdalah is 3 days, that's true, but the principle, everyone agrees. The principle of our Gemara that when it's a situation of Tashlumin, that you don't do Tashlumin if you were ineligible. So Tefillah we say the Zman is all morning. Havdalah we say the Zman is the first 3 days. Birchas HaShachar, it's true that you can say Birchas HaShachar a couple of hours into the day, but the real Zman of Birchas HaShachar, you say Anosim L'Sech V'Vina, when you hear Kriyas HaGever, when you hear the cock crow, that's when it's time for Birchas HaShachar. You can do it later, but that's Tashlumin the Magen Avraham understood. So if you were an onain at the crack of dawn in the morning when the rooster started to crow, at that point you're an onain, Magen Avraham holds that the rest of the Zman of Birchas HaShachar is Tashlumin, and when it's Tashlumin, we have our Gemara, the Lo Chazi Barisha and Lo Chazi Bakulu. You can't do Tashlumin when you were ineligible during the Iker Zman. On Daf Pei Aleph, the Gemara talks about some of the laws of Nida. Rabbi Yossi Shita is, so the halacha is that midaraisa, a woman is a shomeres yom keneged yom. She sees dam. Today we always wait zayin nikiyim, but Medina de Gemara, a woman sees dam 1 day. If it's below esni dasa, it's not part of her regular period. So then 1 day she becomes a shomeres yom. She has to wait 1 day. If she sees dam again before she has a chance to clear herself by seeing a clean day, that becomes 2 re'iyos. And if she sees again a 3rd day, that becomes 3 days, and then she becomes a zava gedola, which is we treat all of our dam as zava gedola, but that's the din daraisa. Rabbi Yossi Shita is, the Gemara says, Mikan labahi mitama. that if a woman sees dam, then she waits to see if the next day will be clean. If she sees dam again, she becomes tamei again. But we don't say retroactively she was always tamei. The first day, the day passed, and the next day started, and she was clean. So that's considered shemeres yom keneged yom. And the next riyah she sees is a new tumah. So the Gemara says, really? If as soon as the next day starts, she already had a shmira for the first day, and now her tumah is cleared, now she has new tumah, how does she ever become a zava gedola? Because each day, if she sees dam 3 days in a row, she can't see 3 times in one day. That doesn't make her a zava gedola. She has to see dam on 3 consecutive days. Again, we're machmer even for one time, but Medina the Torah, Medina the Gemara, before the Chumrah of Reb Zera, before certain Chumras, you have to see 3 days in a row. So the Gemara asks, how do you see 3 days in a row? Each day, when the next morning comes, she's cleared, and then it starts again. So how do you get to 3 days? So the Gemara has a couple of pshatim. She sees constantly, without any break, or she saw ben hashmashos between the 2 days. She saw during ben hashmashos, so the day never started, the night never started with cleanliness to clear her status of tumah. Then the Gemara makes it clear that this is only a possibility if she sees ben hashmashos. If she just sees in the middle of the night for a few days in a row, that would, according to Rabbi Yossi, that she would be fine, because that would be shmira. And Tosfos and Rashi seem to assume that they begin by assuming that means shmiras laila is shmira, that each night, when the first hour of the night passes and she hasn't seen dam yet, that's considered shmira, the shmira of the first hour of the night. Then when she sees at 12 o'clock every night, that starts again. That gets reset because she was clean for the beginning of the night. Shmiras laila, havi shmira. That's the starting position of Rashi and Tosfos. And that's why they explain the Gemara that that's what Rashi says, and that's what Tosfos starts. That's why the Gemara didn't say that she saw at night, because if she didn't see ben hashmashos, if she saw at night, we would say sfiras laila, shmiras laila, havi shmira, and that resets her calendar. Tosfos, however, is not satisfied with this. Tosfos says that elsewhere the Gemara makes it clear that shmiras laila, shimur b'yamamahu, and not b'laila. Shmiras laila, sfiras laila does not work. So Tosfos concludes sfiras laila does not work. So the beginning of the night being clean doesn't help you. That doesn't make her tar. So why can't we just say that a woman becomes a zava by seeing 3 times in the middle of the night? Because the shmira the next day would be a shmira. Just like you can have a shmira in the first few hours of the day, you can have a shmira in the last few hours of the day. So if she saw every night at midnight, then when the sun rose in the next morning and she was clean until the next midnight, then that next day would be considered a shmira. So Tosfos comes out, you can have a shmira either mitchilas hayom, the first few hours of the day before you saw, or besof hayom, if you saw and then you were clean to the end of the day, that could be a shmira. What you can't have is middle of the day. If you saw ben hashmashos, the beginning and end of each day, then the shmira in the middle of the day doesn't count. But Tosfos says, you can have mixas hayom, you can have beginning of the day or the end of the day. However, Tosfos' maskana is, shmiras laila, sfiras laila doesn't count. That what happens at night, if you see down, you become tamei. But the flip side is that if you have a shmira, that if you have a clean period at night, if you have a shmira at night, that does not count. This has a major practical application. A woman who is counting Zayin Nikiyim. Again, we said earlier, our women always count Zayin Nikiyim even when they see dam just once. A woman who counts Zayin Nikiyim does bedikas, ideally every day. The question is, when are these bedikas done? Standard practice is one in the morning and one in the late afternoon. The halacha is, l'chatchila, a woman should not do these bedikas at night. Why not? So one reason given is because they're hard to see at night. If you want to, certainly before they had electric lighting, they were hard to see at night. And we want you to do the bedikas during the day. You can always keep them around till the next morning, but one reason given is that you want to make sure you can see them. But there's another reason. Some poskim say, based on Shitas Tosfos, since we paskin shmiras laila is not shmira, sfiras laila is not sfira, what happens at night is not considered a bedika. That's not part of her sfiras zayin nikiyim. Some rishonim, some poskim hold that doing bedikas is part of the sfira, and therefore the sfira at night doesn't count, and the bedika at night doesn't count. And meikra din, not just because it's hard to see, meikra din, you can't do bedikas at night. Rabbi Fora says in his book on Nida, this is the opinion of most poskim. He says even though the Shulchan Aruch doesn't really articulate this, the Shulchan Aruch just warns you about not doing them at night because it's hard to see. But he says most poskim say that a bedika at night is not good, and therefore you should make sure to do the bedika during the day, ideally after sunrise, but at least during the day. And the second bedika should be done before nightfall, because the bedika, again, the hefsek tara is a whole separate question. The hefsek tara, it's crucial to do that during the day, because otherwise you lose one day of your counting. we're not talking about the Hefsek Tara. We're talking about the 7 Bedikas, the Bedika she does every day of her Zayin Nikiyim after the Hefsek Tara. Those Bedikas, according to many poskim, based on the discussion in our Sugya and elsewhere, those Bedikas, according to many poskim, most poskim, according to Rabbi Forrest, must be done during the day, not at night, because Shmira of night, Bedika of night, Sphira of night doesn't count. On Daf Pei Beis, the Mishnah started on the end of Pei Hey. The Mishnah said that when they would burn a carbon Pesach that became Tameh, so it says they would burn it Lefnei Habira, in front of the Beis HaMikdash, Me'ati HaMaracha, using the wood from the temple treasury, using the Ati HaMaracha, not using private wood. The Gemara goes on. The Gemara says, if a person wants to bring his own wood, he wants to burn it Lefnei Habira, Ba'atzei Atzmo, his own wood, we don't let him do that. Why not? So the Gemara says, it sounds like you're just being generous. You're donating extra wood, so you don't have to use Hektish's wood. So what's wrong with doing that? So the Gemara brings two explanations. One is, we don't want to humiliate those who don't have wood. They might start feeling pressure to bring their own. They might feel embarrassed. They can't bring their own. The other reason is the Pnei HaChashad. Pnei HaChashad means, Rashi explains, that when people brought wood to burn the carbon, if they had leftover wood, they would bring the leftover wood back home. So if a person brought his own wood, he would say, okay, it's my wood, I can bring it home. People wouldn't realize it was his own wood because you're supposed to use Atzei HaMaracha. So they would say, oh, he's taking Atzei HaMaracha wood and packing them and walking home. So Pnei HaChashad, you shouldn't do that because people will think that you're stealing wood from the Atzei HaMaracha. This is a concern we find in a number of places in Chazal, especially when dealing with, so in general, you should avoid Maras Ha'ayin, you should avoid people being choshed you for Averis, but particularly in the context of breaching the public trust and embezzling public funds, we find a number of different halachas in the literature of Chazal that they were very, very concerned with this. In Yoma, the Gemara says, Beis Garmu, the family that prepared the Lechem Apanim, it says they were praised because in their homes they never had pas nikia. They never had high quality, fine bread, because people would say they're embezzling from the Lechem Apanim. The Yisim Nikiyim Hashem Yisrael. A person is obligated not just to be impeachable, to be unimpeachable in his conduct before God, but also before people. People should have no grounds to accuse him of anything, even unjustly. Similarly, Beis Avtinas, they were a family that prepared the Ketaris. So it says, again, they were praised because in their homes, a kala, a bride, they used to use perfumes and different types of cosmetics that had good smells. So their women didn't use that. Their women didn't use these cosmetics, and even when they married a woman from another family, they would stipulate, no cosmetics for you. So people shouldn't say that they're pilfering from the Ketaris. They're using Ketaris, people might, tongues would wag, people would be cynical, and so on. So they would avoid the slightest hint of suspicion. You have to be beyond reproach. You have to avoid even the appearance of corruption. These are other examples of the need to avoid even the incorrect criticism of embezzlement. Similarly, in Shkolim, it says when the Kohanim would go in to take the money from the pile of Shkolim, from the temple treasury, they would have to dress in such a way that they wouldn't have things like hems in their clothing, cuffs where people would think that they're secreting money in there. They didn't have tefillin or amulets or even sandals where they could slip money in and carry them out. Everyone had to see, they had to have radical transparency. Nobody could possibly accuse them of embezzling. And again, people are cynical. The Mishnah explains, if the Kohanim were to become poor, if they would suffer a reversal in fortune, people would say, oh, they're being punished from cheating hektish. And if they would get rich, they would say, oh, they got away with it. Hashem let them steal from Trumas Halishka. So whether they get rich or poor, people will find some way to accuse them of stealing. Therefore, they have to be absolutely above reproach. Again, the Yisim Nikiyim Hashem Yisrael, that they have to avoid any hint of suspicion. In Bava Basra, the Gemara says, Gabai Tzedakah. People, officers in charge of tzedakah, they would have to go in pairs. They can't split up. Rashi says, Pnei HaChashad, people shouldn't say he's by himself, he's taking advantage of pocketing some money. And so on. And it says that if the person who collects the money, if he just found money in the street, he shouldn't just slip the money into his wallet. People say, oh, he's pocketing tzedakah money and putting it in his wallet. He has to put it into the tzedakah money. He can't do anything that would possibly give anybody a reason to be suspicious and think that he is cheating. The Gemara goes on, brings further halachas, that when they make change, so that they can't take tzedakah money and make change and take money for themselves, people will just think that they're using an unfavorable rate. This is probably more true in the time of Chazal, where the rates weren't absolutely standardized. You had to evaluate how big a coin was or what quality a coin was. Coins are more standard, maybe that's less of an issue, and so on. But there are all kinds of halachas of Pnei Chashad, and again, the Rambam says, the Isim Nikim Hashem Yisrael, just like Beis Avtinas and Beis Garmu. The Torah goes so far as to say that Gabbai Tzedakah, officers in charge of Tzedakah, Meikra Din, they don't have to give accounting, they don't have to present an accounting of all their activities to the public. However, they don't have to, but it's recommended. Kadesh Yun Nikiyim Hashem Yisrael, the same ideal of the Isim Nikiyim, Tov. We don't require them to, but it's recommended that they make an accounting, so they should stay as far from suspicion as they possibly can. Beis Yosef says, what's the source for this? Pashadu. It's obvious. Of course, there's an ideal to be as far from reproach as they can. The Aruch HaShulchan says, if it's really such an ideal, so why didn't Chazal make it a chiyuv? Why didn't they require them to give an accounting? So he says that it's even though the other things Chazal did make rules, where all the things you're not allowed to do, those things were much more easily led to chashad, but the cheshbon, there was less of a reason. He says that there's no reason for people to suspect him even if he doesn't give an accounting. Today we tend to think differently. Today we say without accountability, without open and transparent records, there's ample source for chashad. But Chazal felt, according to the Aruch HaShulchan, that simply by not providing a cheshbon, that wasn't something that was necessary to allay any suspicion. Furthermore, he says cheshbon is yesh harbe tarach. Making a cheshbon is a very onerous task. Today we pay accountants to do it, I guess, then it costs money. So it's burdensome. So Chazal didn't want to make it a requirement because it was burdensome. It's still an ideal, the Torah says, but it wasn't strictly a requirement. And the Aruch HaShulchan adds, however, he says that this is all by default. If you didn't ask them, you didn't tell them up front, we're appointing you to a position of trust, and we expect an accounting, by default, if this wasn't demanded up front, then they don't have to provide one. It's still an ideal, but they don't have to. However, the Aruch HaShulchan says if when they were appointed, the terms of their appointment was that they would have to be accountable, they would have to provide an accounting, then certainly they're chayav. And K'madumani, he says, he thinks shekena minhag, as we do things today. The minhag is today we much more routinely expect accounting. Certainly of public trust, we expect a proper accounting and transparency. And he says, certainly he says that's the minhag, that even though according to strict halacha and accounting is not required, it's always an ideal, the Torah says, and today the minhag is that we stipulate in advance and we do require it. Furthermore, the Aruch HaShulchan says that the only time when we say that an accounting is not strictly required if it wasn't stipulated, that is with regard to a volunteer. But in a case where the officer is paid, then certainly he says he is obligated, mikra din, to provide an accounting.